Jake Morrison stood on his porch watching the sun drop toward the western hills, and he thought about how most people called him crazy for living out here alone beyond the safety zones where the electromagnetic fences kept the dangerous animals away from the human settlements. But Jake did not care what they thought, because he had a dream that someday humanity would stop hiding behind walls and start living like their ancestors did back on Earth, when people knew how to work with the land instead of just taking from it and running away when things got difficult. His ranch stretched across 3,000 acres of real grass and real soil on the frontier planet called Nueva Vista, and he had 200 head of cattle that had been modified to breathe the thinner air, but otherwise they were just regular cows that ate grass and made milk, and eventually became food, just like cows had done for thousands of years. And Jake was proud of every single one of them, because they represented something important that most colonists had forgotten about. The other settlers thought he was insane for leaving the protected zones where everything was controlled and safe. But Jake knew something they did not know, which was that Earth was dying because people had forgotten how to live with nature instead of against it. And if humanity was going to survive on new worlds, they needed to remember those old skills before it was too late. And somebody had to be the first one to try, even if everyone thought they were crazy for doing it. He picked up his coffee mug and took a long drink of the bitter liquid while he looked out at his fields where the cattle were grazing peacefully in the fading light, and he felt a deep satisfaction knowing that he had built all of this with his own two hands, without relying on the big corporations or the government support systems that kept most colonists dependent and afraid. That was when his wrist scanner started beeping with an urgent warning tone that made his stomach drop, because he knew that sound meant something big was approaching his property. And when he pulled up the display, he saw 300 red dots moving in a coordinated pattern straight toward his ranch, and his hands started shaking as he zoomed in to get more details. The scanner identified them as Apache warriors, which was the name that early colonists had given to a species of aggressive aliens that looked sort of like humans, but with hard shells covering their bodies and long claws that could cut through metal. And they were known for attacking settlements and taking over territory, and nobody had ever successfully negotiated with them before. 300 of them were heading directly toward his ranch, and according to the scanner, they would reach his fence line in less than 20 minutes. And Jake felt his heart pounding in his chest because he knew that calling for help would be pointless since the nearest military base was 6 hours away by fast transport, and by the time anyone arrived, there would be nothing left but ashes and bones. Most people would have jumped in their vehicle and driven away as fast as possible. But Jake looked at his ranch and thought about every fence post he had hammered into the ground and every irrigation line he had laid out by hand. And every morning, he had woken up early to check on the cattle and make sure the water was flowing properly. And he realized he could not just abandon it all without at least trying to do something. He ran toward his workshop where he kept all his tools and equipment and spare parts, and his mind was racing, trying to think of anything he could use to defend himself against 300 warriors who were bigger and stronger and meaner than he could ever hope to be. And he knew he did not have any real weapons because ranchers were not allowed to keep military-grade equipment without special permits. But Jake had something better than weapons, which was knowledge about his ranch and all the systems he had built to keep it running. And he knew every pipe and wire and machine on his property, and he started grabbing things and throwing them into a pile while an idea began forming in his head that was either brilliant or completely insane, but it was the only chance he had. The Apache warriors were known to be curious creatures who would investigate anything unusual before attacking, and that curiosity had helped them survive and become dominant predators on their homeworld, but it also meant they could be distracted. And maybe if Jake could make something interesting enough, they would pause long enough for him to try talking to them instead of just fighting. He grabbed his welding torch and started cutting apart the pressure regulators from his irrigation system, and his hands were steady, even though his mind was screaming at him that this was a terrible idea. But he kept working, because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant losing everything he had worked for. The methane processing plant that he used to convert cow manure into fuel for his generators was sitting in the corner of his workshop, and it had been giving him problems for weeks because the pressure valves were not working properly, and he had been meaning to fix them, but he had been too busy with other things. And now those broken valves might actually save his life if he could figure out how to use them. Jake pulled out long coils of high-pressure tubing and started connecting them together in a pattern that covered the open field, where the Apache warriors would have to cross to reach his buildings, and he was working so fast that sweat was pouring down his face and soaking through his shirt. But he did not have time to rest because the scanner was counting down the minutes until contact 15 minutes left, and he was dragging equipment across his field and setting up what he hoped would look like some kind of defensive system, even though it was really just a bunch of farming equipment connected in ways it was never meant to be used. And he knew that if the Apache warriors were not curious enough to investigate before attacking, then his plan would fail completely. He ran back to his workshop and grabbed every emergency flare he had, which was supposed to be used for signaling rescue ships if something went wrong. But now he was going to use them for something completely different, and he started placing them at specific points around the field, creating a pattern that he hoped would be impressive enough to make the warriors pause. 10 minutes left, and Jake was connecting the last few wires to his makeshift control system, which was really just a modified remote for his irrigation system. But the Apache warriors would not know that, and as long as it looked dangerous, they might think twice before rushing into attack. He stood in the middle of his field holding the control device and breathing hard from all the running around, and his legs were shaking from exhaustion and fear. But he forced himself to stand up straight and look confident, even though he felt like his insides were turning to water. 5 minutes left, and the sun was almost completely down below the horizon, and Jake could see dust rising from the hills to the east where the Apache warriors were approaching. And he took a deep breath and tried to calm his racing heart, because he needed to think clearly for what was about to happen. He thought about all the people back in the settlements who had laughed at him for wanting to be a rancher in the wilderness, and he wondered if they would ever know what happened out here tonight and whether they would think he was brave or just stupid for not running away when he had the chance. But it did not really matter what they thought, because Jake had made his choice when he decided to build this ranch, and now he was going to defend it with everything he had, even if everything he had was just some broken equipment and a crazy idea that probably would not work. The scanner beeped one last time and went silent, and Jake looked up to see the Apache warriors cresting the ridge like a dark wave of death flowing toward him. The Apache warriors came over the ridge like a nightmare made real, and in the dying light their shells gleamed with an oily shine that made them look like they were covered in wet metal, and they moved together with perfect coordination like a single organism with 300 legs, and Jake could see that each one was nearly 7 feet tall with arms that ended in claws that looked like they could tear through anything. They stopped at his fence line and spread out in a half circle, formation that showed they knew exactly what they were doing. And this was not just a random mob, but a trained military force that had probably destroyed dozens of settlements before coming to his ranch. And Jake felt his throat go dry as he realized just how badly outmatched he was. One warrior stepped forward from the group, and Jake could tell it was their leader, because it had darker armor and bones tied to its arms and legs, like decorations or maybe trophies from previous battles, and it made a series of clicking sounds that his universal translator tried to convert into words, but the translation was rough and barely understandable. The translator said something about this land belonging to them now, and the humans should leave or die, and Jake felt anger rising up through his fear, because he had worked too hard to just give up without even trying, and he raised his hand and pressed the first button on his control device. Every emergency flare in the field ignited at exactly the same moment, and the sudden burst of brilliant red light was so bright that the Apache warriors stumbled backward, and their large compound eyes were clearly not designed to handle rapid changes in brightness, and Jake used that moment to activate his suit speakers, so his voice would carry across the field. He had spent his last few minutes programming his translator to convert his words into the Apache language, and he knew it would probably sound terrible, but he hoped it would be good enough to understand, and he spoke slowly and clearly, saying that this was sacred ground, protected by ancient spirits, and anyone who crossed the circle of fire would face judgment. It was completely made up, and Jake felt ridiculous saying it, but he also knew that the Apache culture had deep spiritual beliefs, and they respected the supernatural even when dealing with other species. And if he could make them think twice about attacking, then maybe he could buy enough time to try something else. The warriors were chittering among themselves, and their leader stepped closer to the fence and made more clicking sounds that the translator converted into a single word, which was "prove it." And Jake felt his stomach sink because he had hoped they would just be scared enough to leave. But apparently these warriors were not easily frightened. 3 warriors climbed over his fence and walked into the field with their claws extended, and they moved with casual confidence like they were not worried at all about whatever tricks this human might have. And Jake watched them get closer to the center of the field where he had set up his trap. He waited until they were standing right on top of the marked area, and then he pressed the second button, on his control, and the methane system came to life, but not with fire, like the warriors were probably expecting. Instead, it released all the built-up pressure at once, through a network of pipes that he had arranged to create a massive wall of sound. Noise was like nothing Jake had ever heard before, and it was so loud that it made his teeth hurt, even through his protective suit. And the frequency was specifically chosen to be right at the edge of what Apache hearing could tolerate. And the 3 warriors in the field stumbled and clutched at their heads, trying to block out the painful sound. Before they could recover, Jake triggered the third part of his trap, which was a series of small trenches he had dug and covered with thin material that looked solid, but would collapse under weight, and the 3 warriors fell through and landed in knee-deep mud that he had created by flooding the trenches with water from his irrigation system. Then the irrigation sprayers kicked in, but instead of water they were spraying a mixture of bioluminescent algae that Jake used for his fish farm, and the algae glowed bright green in the darkness and mixed with smoke from his smoke generators, the whole field filled with swirling green mist that looked incredibly spooky and mysterious. The 3 warriors struggled to get out of the mud while green glowing mist swirled around them, and the sound continued to blast their sensitive ears. And to the watching war party it must have looked like their warriors had been swallowed by supernatural forces and were being tormented by spirits. Jake let it run for about 30 seconds, which felt like hours, and then he shut everything down, and the field went quiet, except for the sound of the 3 warriors scrambling out of the trenches and running back to their lines while making embarrassed clicking sounds and covered in glowing green algae that made them look like they had been marked by ghosts. The leader stared at Jake with new intensity, and its compound eyes reflected the remaining flare light in a way that made it impossible to read its expression. But then its translator device activated, and a mechanical voice said in perfect standard language that Jake was either very brave or very foolish. Jake replied that he was probably both. But this land was his, and he had earned it by working it with his own hands. And if they wanted to take it, they would have to go through him. And he promised that the spirits would make them pay for every inch of ground they took. It was a complete bluff because Jake had maybe one more trick left before his improvised defenses were exhausted, but he tried to look confident and dangerous, like he had an entire arsenal of supernatural weapons waiting to be deployed, and he hoped the Apache leader would not call his bluff. The standoff continued and neither side moved, and Jake could feel sweat running down his back despite the cool evening air, and his legs were shaking from standing so still. But he refused to show any weakness because the moment he looked scared they would attack. Then something unexpected happened, and one of the younger warriors broke away from the group and approached the fence alone without any weapons. And it moved slowly and carefully in a way that Jake recognized from his research as meaning peaceful intent. The young warrior stopped at the fence and made clicking sounds, and Jake's translator worked hard to convert them into words that said something about how Jake tended the grazing animals and made water flow and did the work of the land. Jake said yes, that was what he did, and the young warrior gestured at the surrounding landscape, and then back at his ranch and said that Jake did not just take from the land, but gave back to it and made it stronger, and the grass grew better where his cattle grazed. That was when Jake suddenly understood what was happening, and he realized the Apache warriors were not mindless raiders who just destroyed everything they found, but were actually protecting their territory, because they lived in balance with the land, and what they had seen from other human colonists was destruction and exploitation. But Jake was different, because he was actually trying to live with the land instead of just using it up and moving on. And the young warrior had noticed this and was trying to tell the others. Jake spoke carefully and said he was a rancher, which was an old Earth word for someone who tends land and animals and does not mine or strip or destroy, but instead cultivates and protects and lives with the land as part of it, not separate from it. The young warrior turned and started making rapid clicking sounds at the leader, and soon other warriors joined in. And Jake watched nervously as what looked like an argument broke out among the Apache war party. The argument among the Apache warriors grew louder and more intense, and Jake could see different groups forming as some seemed to agree with the young warrior, while others were making aggressive gestures and clicking angrily, and he had no idea which side was winning. But he knew his fate depended on the outcome of this debate. Finally, the leader raised one massive claw, and the entire war party went silent immediately, and the leader turned to look at Jake with those unreadable compound eyes, and then it did something that surprised everyone, including apparently some of its own warriors, because there were gasps and clicks of shock. The leader climbed over the fence alone and walked slowly across the field toward Jake, and every step it took made the ground shake slightly because these creatures were heavy and powerful, and Jake felt his heart trying to escape through his throat, but he forced himself to stand still and wait. The leader stopped about 10 feet away, and Jake could now see the scars on its armor and the way its claws had been sharpened from years of use, and he realized this was a warrior who had survived countless battles and probably killed more beings than Jake could imagine. The leader's translator crackled to life and said in that mechanical voice that Jake claimed to be of the land and claimed the spirits protected him, but he used machines and tricks, and how could he be both a spiritual guardian and a technological trickster? Jake thought fast and said that the spirits worked through those who understood them, and his people had forgotten how to listen to the earth, and he came here to remember, and the machines were just tools like any other tools, and what mattered was how they were used and whether they helped the land or hurt it. The leader made a sound that the translator could not convert, but Jake thought it might have been something like a grunt of acknowledgement, and then the leader asked if Jake's tricks were exhausted, or if he had more defenses waiting. This was the critical moment, and Jake knew that if he lied and got caught it would be over, but if he admitted weakness, they might attack immediately, and he decided to gamble on honesty with just a hint of ambiguity. Said he had one more demonstration, but he preferred not to use it because it would damage the land he was trying to protect. And the leader tilted its head in what might have been curiosity and said, "Show us." Jake pressed his final button and the methane processing plant roared to life, and the broken pressure valve that he had been meaning to fix for weeks suddenly became the most important piece of equipment on his entire rancher. A column of flame shot up into the night sky, reaching at least 20 feet high and fed by weeks of accumulated methane gas, and it burned with a roaring sound that could probably be heard for miles, and the heat was so intense that Jake had to step back, even though he was 50 feet away. The Apache warriors all stepped back from the fence, and some of them raised their claws defensively, and the leader stood very still watching the pillar of fire, with what Jake hoped was respect, and maybe a little bit of fear. Jake let it burn for 30 seconds while he frantically worked his emergency override trying to shut down the valve before the whole system exploded, and finally the valve responded and the flame died down, leaving scorch marks on the ground and smoke drifting across the field. He turned back to the Apache leader and tried to look calm even though his hands were shaking, and he said that if he released all the gas at once, nothing would survive, including his ranch and the warriors and the land for miles around. And was that what they wanted? The leader stared at the scorched ground for a long moment, and then it made a sound that Jake had never heard an Apache make before, and his translator labeled it as laughter, and the leader's whole body shook with what was apparently amusement. The leader said that Jake was insane to stand alone against 300 warriors armed with nothing but broken machines and smoke and mirrors, and that he threatened to destroy everything rather than surrender, and he was either the bravest fool or the most foolish brave creature the leader had ever encountered. Jake said he preferred to think of himself as determined, and the leader made that laughing sound again, and then asked how Jake managed his ranch with so much land and so many animals. Jake said he did it alone with the help of his machines, and the leader seemed shocked and said that was impossible because the Apache had 300 warriors to tend 5,000 sections of land, but Jake was claiming to tend 3,000 sections by himself. Jake explained that he used different methods and his machines helped with the work. But yes, he did manage the ranch alone, and the leader went very quiet, and Jake could almost see it thinking behind those alien eyes. Then the leader said something that Jake never expected to hear, which was "teach us," and Jake was so surprised that he actually took a step backward and asked what the leader meant. The leader explained that the Apache were losing their hunting grounds because other humans came and cut down forests and poisoned rivers and stripped the land bare, and then moved on to the next world, leaving nothing but wasteland behind, and the Apache needed new territory to survive. But if Jake could tend land better than they could with fewer hands, then he had knowledge they desperately needed, and the leader said they had come to take this land by force, but perhaps there was a better way. Jake felt like his brain had stopped working because he had been prepared to die defending his ranch, but he had not been prepared to become a teacher to an alien species. And he asked if the leader really wanted to learn ranching from a human. The leader said they wanted to survive, and Jake had survived, where others failed, and that was worth more than conquest. And besides, any creature crazy enough to threaten mutual destruction rather than surrender was either worth learning from or too dangerous to fight. Jake looked at the 300 warriors, waiting beyond his fence, and then at the leader standing in his field. And he thought about everything he had built and everything he believed about humanity, needing to learn how to live with the land again. Maybe teaching the Apache was just an extension of that dream, and maybe if humans and aliens could learn to work together instead of fighting over resources, then maybe there was hope for everyone. And Jake realized he was probably still crazy, but it was a different kind of crazy now. He took a deep breath and said yes, he would teach them, but they had to promise to follow his methods and respect the land, and not just take what they wanted and leave destruction behind. The leader made a gesture that Jake's research told him was a sign of agreement and binding promise in Apache culture. And the leader said they would learn, and they would protect the land as Jake did, and in return, they would help him expand his ranch and defend it from those who would destroy it. Jake nodded and extended his hand in the human gesture of agreement, and the leader looked at the hand for a moment before carefully touching it with the back of its claw in what Jake hoped was the Apache equivalent of a handshake. The first week was harder than Jake had expected because teaching alien warriors how to be ranchers was not something covered in any manual or training program, and there were constant misunderstandings about everything from how to repair fences to why the cattle needed to be moved to different pastures regularly. 20 Apache warriors stayed behind while the rest returned to their territories, and these 20 were supposed to be the first students who would learn Jake's methods and then teach others. But they arrived with no understanding of farming or ranching and had to start from absolute basics. The first major problem came on the second day when Jake tried to explain the concept of irrigation and why they needed to bring water to the fields instead of just letting rain do the work. And the Apache warriors kept insisting that manipulating water was disrespectful to the natural order. Jake spent 3 hours trying to explain that irrigation was not about controlling nature, but about working with it and helping plants grow in areas where they would naturally struggle. And eventually one of the younger warriors named Kresh understood and helped explain it to the others in terms they could grasp. Kresh became Jake's unofficial translator for cultural concepts and helped bridge the gap between human and Apache ways of thinking. And Jake learned that Kresh had been the young warrior who first suggested that Jake might be different from other humans. The cattle were another challenge because the Apache were natural hunters, and their instinct when they saw the cows was to hunt them, not tend them, and Jake had to physically stop 3 different warriors from trying to chase down cattle during the first week. He explained that these animals were partners, not prey, and that by protecting them and helping them thrive, the ranch would produce food for years instead of just one meal. And this concept was so foreign to the Apache way of thinking that it took days for them to accept it. But once they understood the idea of sustainable food production, the Apache took to it with surprising enthusiasm, and they started asking questions about breeding and genetics and how to improve the herd over time. And Jake realized these were not simple warriors, but intelligent beings who had just never been exposed to these concepts before. The real breakthrough came when Jake took them out to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a storm, and he showed them how to properly set posts and string wire, and explained why the fence was important for managing the herd's movement. The Apache had always seen fences as barriers that restricted natural movement, but Jake helped them understand that fences were actually tools for protecting the land by preventing overgrazing and allowing sections to recover and regenerate. One warrior named Branch made the connection that this was similar to how Apache territories worked, with different clans rotating through hunting grounds to prevent depletion and suddenly the entire concept of ranch management made sense to them in a way it had not before. Branch was the oldest of the students, and Jake learned that this warrior was actually a senior member of the war party who had chosen to stay and learn personally instead of sending younger warriors, and this showed how seriously the Apache were taking this opportunity. Jake also learned things from the Apache that surprised him, because they knew things about Nueva Vista's ecosystem that no human researcher had discovered, and they could predict weather patterns by observing insect behavior and could identify which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous. Kresh showed him a native plant that, when ground up and mixed with water, created a natural fertilizer that was better than anything Jake had been using, and when he tested it on a small section of field, the results were remarkable. Branch taught him how to read the soil by texture and smell to know what nutrients were missing, and while Jake had equipment that could analyze soil composition, the Apache method was faster and did not require any technology. The partnership started to feel less like teaching and more like collaboration, and Jake realized that what he had thought was going to be him instructing primitive aliens was actually an exchange of knowledge between two different approaches to living with the land. By the end of the first month, the Apache students had learned the basics of ranching and were able to handle most daily tasks without supervision, and Jake was able to start planning expansion of the ranch with their help. Word spread to other Apache clans about what was happening at Jake's ranch, and more warriors started arriving, asking if they could learn as well. And Jake found himself in the strange position of having to turn students away because he could not teach everyone at once. He worked out a system where the first 20 students would return to their clans after 3 months and start their own ranches using his methods. And then new students would come to learn from Jake while the graduates could help teach others. The colonial administration finally noticed what was happening when supply manifests showed Jake's ranch suddenly producing 3 times as much food as before, and they sent an inspector to investigate whether he was using illegal labor or violating some regulation. The inspector was a middle-aged woman named Helen Price, who arrived expecting to find violations and instead found humans and Apache working side by side to tend cattle and maintain irrigation systems, and she stood in the middle of the ranch with her mouth open, unable to process what she was seeing. Jake explained the arrangement and showed her the contracts he had drawn up, making the Apache students official employees of the ranch, and Helen kept shaking her head and saying this was impossible because everyone knew the Apache were hostile raiders who could not be negotiated. With Jake invited her to stay for dinner, and she sat at his table with Branch and Kresh and 3 other Apache warriors and watched them discuss crop rotation and breeding strategies like they were old colleagues, and she realized that everything the colonial administration thought they knew about the Apache was wrong. Helen asked Branch why the Apache had been attacking human settlements if they were capable of peaceful cooperation, and Branch explained that they had only attacked settlements that were destroying the land and poisoning the water and killing the wildlife, and they had been trying to protect their world from invasion. But Jake was different because he worked with the land instead of against it, and he was willing to teach instead of just take, and that made him worth protecting instead of fighting. Helen returned to the colonial administration headquarters and filed a report that was so unusual and unexpected that it triggered an emergency council meeting, and within a week a full delegation was being organized to come investigate Jake's ranch and determine if this model could be replicated. Jake was not sure he wanted that much attention, because he had just been trying to save his ranch and accidentally started a revolution in human-alien relations, but Branch told him that this was exactly what both species needed and they should not hide from it. The colonial administration delegation arrived 2 months after Helen's first visit, and they brought news crews and scientists and military observers, and they all wanted to see the impossible ranch where humans and Apache worked together. Jake had tried to prepare for their arrival by cleaning up the ranch and making sure everything looked professional, but Branch insisted that they should show the visitors the truth, not some cleaned-up version, and that meant showing them the real work of running a ranch. So when the delegation arrived, they found Jake and Kresh in the middle of delivering a calf, because one of the cows was having trouble with birth, and there was blood and mud everywhere, and Jake was shouting instructions while Kresh carefully helped pull the calf free. The news cameras caught everything, and within hours the images of a human rancher and an Apache warrior working together to save a calf's life were being broadcast across every human colony world, and people could not believe what they were seeing. The delegation spent a week at the ranch observing and asking questions and interviewing both Jake and the Apache students, and what they found challenged every assumption the colonial administration had made about frontier settlement and alien relations. The scientists were fascinated by how much the Apache knew about Nueva Vista's ecosystem and how their traditional knowledge combined with human technology created better results than either approach alone. The military observers were shocked that the same warriors who had destroyed 3 military outposts the previous year were now peacefully tending cattle and learning sustainable agriculture. But the most important person in the delegation was Commander Helen Price, who had been promoted and given authority to develop new protocols for human-alien cooperation, and she spent most of her time talking to Branch about Apache culture and what they needed from humans. Branch explained that the Apache did not want humans to leave Nueva Vista, but they wanted humans to stop destroying the planet, and if humans could learn to live like Jake did, then there was room for everyone. The Apache had been fighting because they thought humans only knew how to consume and destroy, but Jake had shown them that some humans understood stewardship and sustainability, and those humans were worth working with. Helen asked, what would happen if more humans came and started ranches like Jake's? And Branch said that would be acceptable as long as they followed the same principles and respected the land and were willing to learn from the Apache as well as teach them. This led to long negotiations between the colonial administration and the Apache clan leaders, and Jake found himself in the middle of everything, because both sides trusted him and wanted his input on how to structure the new agreements. Jake felt overwhelmed because he was just a rancher, not a diplomat or politician, but Helen told him that was exactly why both sides trusted him, and his perspective was more valuable than any trained negotiator, because he understood both the practical reality and the principles involved. The negotiations took 3 months, and, during that time, Jake continued running his ranch with help from the Apache students, and several human families from nearby settlements came to ask if they could learn his methods as well. Jake started holding weekly classes where he taught both humans and Apache together about sustainable farming and ranching. And it was strange at first having both species in the same classroom, but soon they were working together naturally and helping each other understand difficult concepts. One human farmer named Ben Carter had been struggling to grow crops in Nueva Vista's soil and was about to give up and return to Earth when he attended Jake's class and learned about the natural fertilizer that Kresh had shown Jake. Ben tried the Apache methods on his farm, and within a month his crop yields doubled, and he came back to Jake with tears in his eyes, saying that he had been about to lose everything. But now he had hope again. Stories like Ben's spread quickly, and more humans started coming to learn from Jake and the Apache, and within 6 months there were 15 new ranches and farms operating on the cooperative model that Jake had accidentally created. The colonial administration finally announced a new policy called the Nueva Vista Cooperative Settlement Program, which encouraged humans to establish ranches and farms using sustainable methods and working in partnership with Apache clans. The program offered incentives for cooperation and penalties for destructive practices, and it created a framework for shared land management that respected both human and Apache territorial needs. Not everyone was happy about the changes, and there were protests from corporations that had been planning large-scale mining operations and from military hardliners who thought the Apache should be forcibly removed from valuable territory. But the protests were overshadowed by the success stories coming from the cooperative ranches and by public opinion, which strongly favored peaceful cooperation. After seeing the images of Jake and Kresh saving that calf, Jake's ranch became a symbol of what was possible when different species chose cooperation over conflict, and he received thousands of messages from people across the colonies saying that he had restored their faith in humanity's ability to do better. He also received hate mail from people who thought he was a traitor for working with aliens and who said he should have fought to the death instead of teaching the enemy. But Jake deleted those messages without reading them completely because he knew those people would never understand what he had learned. Branch told him that there were also Apache who disapproved of the cooperation and who thought their warriors should have taken the land by force. But those voices were growing quieter as more clans saw the benefits of the new approach. The first group of Apache students graduated from Jake's program after 6 months and returned to their clans to start their own ranches, and Jake felt proud watching them leave because he knew they would spread the knowledge further than he ever could. Alone, Kresh chose to stay permanently at Jake's ranch as his partner and co-manager, and together they continued teaching new students while expanding the ranch to cover 12,000 acres. The partnership between Jake and Kresh became famous across the colonies, and they were invited to speak at universities and conferences about their experiences and the lessons they had learned about cooperation and sustainability. Jake never felt comfortable being famous, and he much preferred working on the ranch to giving speeches. But he did it anyway because he knew that spreading the message was important and might help prevent conflicts on other colony worlds. The first real test of the new cooperative system came during the dry season, when the water supplies started running low, and both human and Apache ranches were competing for access to the same rivers and underground aquifers. Jake saw the problem, developing weeks before it became critical, and he called a meeting of all the ranchers in the region, including both humans and Apache, and they gathered in his largest barn to discuss what to do. Some of the human ranchers wanted to claim priority based on their colonial permits, and some of the Apache clans wanted to claim traditional rights based on their longer presence on Nueva Vista, and the meeting quickly became heated with both sides making angry demands. Jake let them argue for an hour, and then he stood up and asked everyone a simple question, which was whether they wanted to fight over water until they all died of thirst, or work together to find a solution that would keep everyone alive. The room went quiet, and Branch stood up beside Jake and said that fighting over resources was what had led to the conflicts in the first place, and if they could not cooperate during a crisis, then the whole experiment was pointless. Kresh suggested that they map out all the water sources and calculate exactly how much each ranch needed to survive, and then figure out a fair distribution system based on need rather than rights or history. It took 3 days of negotiations, but they eventually developed a water-sharing agreement that gave every ranch enough water to survive, while also setting aside reserves for emergency situations and protecting the natural water sources from depletion. The agreement also included a system for monitoring water usage and penalties for anyone who took more than their share. And most importantly, it created a joint council with both human and Apache representatives to manage water resources long-term. When the dry season ended, all the ranches had survived, and the cooperation had actually made them stronger because they had learned to trust each other and work together instead of competing. The success of the water crisis management spread to other regions, and soon similar cooperative councils were being established across Nueva Vista to handle shared resources and resolve disputes peacefully. Jake's ranch continued to grow, and by the end of the second year, it had become the center of a network of cooperative farms and ranches that produced more food than all the corporate agricultural operations combined. The colonial administration was forced to admit that the cooperative model was not just more ethical, but also more efficient and profitable, and they started requiring all new agricultural developments to follow similar principles. But success brought new challenges, and Jake found himself spending more time managing politics and bureaucracy than actually ranching, and he started to miss the simple days when it was just him and his cattle, and nobody cared what he was doing. Kresh noticed Jake's frustration and suggested that they train some of the more experienced students to take over the administrative work, so Jake could focus on what he loved, which was working with the land and animals. They selected 3 humans and 3 Apache, who had shown talent for organization and leadership, and created a management cooperative that would handle the day-to-day decisions, while Jake and Kresh focused on training and development. This turned out to be one of the best decisions they made because the management cooperative brought fresh perspectives and new ideas and freed Jake to do what he was actually good at, which was teaching and innovating. One of the innovations that came from this period was a hybrid building design that combined human technology with Apache architectural principles and created structures that were better suited to Nueva Vista's climate than either species had achieved alone. Another innovation was a new breed of cattle that resulted from Jake working with Apache animal handlers to select for traits that both species valued, and the resulting animals were healthier and more productive than the original stock. As the cooperative ranches became more successful, they started attracting attention from other colony worlds where humans were having conflicts with native species, and delegations came from 3 different planets to study the Nueva Vista model. Jake and Kresh spent weeks showing these visitors how the cooperative system worked and explaining the principles that made it successful, and emphasizing that it only worked because both species were willing to compromise and learn from each other. Some of the visitors tried to implement similar systems on their worlds with mixed results because they discovered that cooperation required more than just good intentions and formal agreements, and needed genuine respect between species. But even partial successes were better than the constant warfare that had characterized human expansion into alien territories, and slowly the Nueva Vista model started influencing colonial policy across human space. Jake received a message one day from the colonial administration offering him a position as director of interspecies agricultural development with a massive salary and an office on the capital world, and he laughed and deleted the message without responding. Kresh asked why he turned it down, and Jake said that he was a rancher, not a bureaucrat, and if he left his ranch to go sit in an office, he would lose the connection to the land that made everything else possible. Branch, who was now semi-retired but still visited regularly, told Jake that refusing the position was wise, because the moment he accepted a government title, he would lose the independence that made him trustworthy to both humans and Apache. The ranch celebrated its 3rd anniversary, with a big gathering that included over 200 people from both species, and there was food and music and children playing together, and Jake looked around at everything they had built and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He remembered standing alone in his field 3 years ago facing 300 warriors and thinking he was going to die. And now those same warriors were his partners and friends, and together they had created something that was changing entire worlds. Helen Price gave a speech at the celebration, talking about how one crazy rancher had done more to advance human-alien relations than decades of diplomatic efforts. And Jake felt embarrassed by the praise but also proud of what they had accomplished together. The real highlight of the celebration was when the Apache performed a traditional ceremony that had never been shared with humans before, and Branch explained that they were formally adopting Jake into their clan as an honorary member, which was the highest honor they could give. Jake accepted the honor with tears in his eyes because he understood what it meant and how much trust it represented, and he promised to uphold the responsibilities that came with clan membership. 5 years after the standoff, Jake stood on his porch watching the sunset and thinking about how much had changed, and the ranch that had started as 3,000 acres with 200 cattle had grown into a cooperative that covered 40,000 acres with over 1,000 head of cattle and employed 60 Apache and 40 humans. The cooperative model had spread to 70 other locations across Nueva Vista and was being implemented on 4 other colony worlds, and Jake had become famous across human space as the man who proved that cooperation was possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. But fame had brought complications, and Jake found himself dealing with journalists and politicians and corporate representatives who all wanted something from him, and sometimes he missed the days when he was just a crazy rancher who everyone ignored. Branch came up beside him and settled onto the reinforced bench they had built specifically to support Apache weight, and the old warrior moved slower now after years of hard work, but his mind was still sharp, and he remained Jake's closest advisor. Branch asked if Jake ever regretted not running that night 5 years ago when the war party had come, and Jake laughed and said he regretted it every day because he still had nightmares about the methane geyser and how easily everything could have gone wrong. Branch made the clicking sound that meant amusement and asked if Jake knew what the War Council had said after they returned from that first meeting. Jake said he assumed they had called him insane, and Branch laughed harder and said yes. But they had also said that if all humans were as crazy as Jake, then the Apache should make peace immediately, because a species that would rather destroy everything than surrender was either too dangerous to fight or too valuable to keep as enemies. They sat together watching the cattle graze and the apprentices closing up the workshops for the evening, and Jake could see human and Apache children playing together in the dust, creating games that mixed traditions from both cultures. Those children were growing up knowing both languages and both cultures, and they would never understand the fear and hatred that had existed between their parents' generations, and Jake thought that was probably the greatest achievement of the cooperative system, Kresh approached with news that another delegation was arriving tomorrow from a colony world called New Brisbane, where humans were having violent conflicts with an insectoid species, and they wanted to learn if the Nueva Vista model could work for them. Jake sighed because he was tired of delegations and teaching and explaining the same principles over and over. But he knew it was important work, and that every world that chose cooperation over conflict was a victory worth fighting for. Branch said that Jake should consider training others to handle the diplomatic work so he could return to ranching full-time. And Jake said he had been thinking the same thing but was not sure who could take over that role. Kresh suggested that the management cooperative could expand to include interspecies relations, and that several of the graduates from their program had shown talent for diplomacy and might be willing to take on that responsibility. Jake liked that idea because it would distribute the work across multiple people instead of relying on him alone, and it would also demonstrate that cooperation was not dependent on any single individual, but was a sustainable system that could survive and grow. Over the next few months, Jake and Kresh worked to establish what they called the Cooperative Relations Institute, which would train diplomats from multiple species to help establish peaceful partnerships on frontier worlds. The institute was located on the ranch, but operated independently and brought together humans and Apache, and eventually members of 3 other species who wanted to learn the principles that had made Nueva Vista successful. Jake taught the first class himself and focused on the practical aspects of cooperation, including how to identify common interests and how to build trust across cultural differences, and how to handle conflicts without resorting to violence. The students were surprised that Jake's approach was so simple and practical, because they had expected complex theories and sophisticated strategies. But Jake insisted that cooperation was not complicated, and mostly required honesty and willingness to compromise. One student from New Brisbane asked what to do if the other species refused to negotiate or cooperate, and Jake said that sometimes you had to make them curious enough to at least listen, and that meant being interesting or surprising or even a little bit crazy. He told them the story of his confrontation with the war party and how he had used smoke and mirrors to buy time, and the students were shocked that the entire cooperative system had started with such desperate improvisation. Branch, who was guest teaching that day, added that desperation often produced the best solutions because when you had no good options left, you were forced to try things that seemed impossible, and sometimes those impossible things actually worked. The institute graduated its first class after 6 months, and those graduates went out to 4 different worlds and began establishing cooperative systems, and within a year, 3 of those worlds reported significant reductions in human-alien conflicts. The 4th world struggled because the local species had no concept of agriculture and lived as nomadic hunters, but even there progress was being made, and the institute sent additional support to help develop appropriate models for that culture. Jake finally stepped back from the diplomatic work and returned to focusing on the ranch, and he found that he had missed the simple satisfaction of physical work and seeing immediate results from his efforts. He spent his days working alongside Apache and human ranchers, fixing fences and tending cattle, and teaching new apprentices, and he was happier than he had been in years, because this was what he had always wanted to do. Kresh remained his partner in managing the ranch, and their friendship had deepened over the years until they could communicate with just a glance or gesture, and Jake often forgot that they were different species because Kresh just felt like family. The ranch itself had become a model of efficiency, combining the best of human technology with Apache ecological knowledge and producing higher yields with less environmental impact than any purely human or Apache operation could achieve. Researchers came from universities across human space to study the ranch, and they published papers about the cooperative model and how it demonstrated that biological diversity led to better outcomes in agriculture, and probably in most other fields as well. Jake read some of those papers and found them amusing, because the researchers were trying to explain with complex theories what seemed obvious to him, which was that different perspectives led to better solutions, and working together was simply smarter than working alone. But he understood that the academic validation was important because it helped convince skeptics and provided evidence for policymakers who wanted to expand the cooperative model to other areas beyond agriculture. 10 years after the confrontation, Jake Morrison sat on his porch at dawn watching the mist rise from the valley and feeling content in a way he had never expected to feel, and the ranch had become more than he ever imagined possible when he first decided to homestead beyond the safety zones. The cooperative system had spread to 27 colony worlds and had become standard practice for frontier settlements, and the violent conflicts between humans and alien species had decreased by 70% across settled space according to the latest colonial administration statistics. Nueva Vista itself had been transformed, and the planet that had once been a battleground between humans and Apache was now a thriving multi-species society with mixed communities and shared governance and children who grew up speaking multiple languages and thinking of cooperation as normal. Jake's original ranch remained at the heart of this transformation and continued to serve as a training center and demonstration site, but it was also just a working ranch where people of both species raised cattle and grew crops and lived their lives. Branch had retired completely now and spent most of his time with the young ones teaching them Apache history and traditions and making sure that the rush to cooperate did not mean losing the unique aspects of Apache culture. Jake understood that concern because he had seen how some humans wanted to blend everything together into a single unified culture, and he agreed with Branch that diversity was strength and each species should maintain their identity while also building bridges to others. Kresh had taken over day-to-day management of the ranch because Jake was getting older and could not work as hard as he once did, and Jake was grateful to have a partner he could trust completely to maintain the principles they had established. The morning was quiet, except for the sounds of cattle and birds and distant voices from the apprentice quarters where the new students were waking up and preparing for another day of learning. And Jake thought about how peaceful everything had become. He remembered the terror he had felt standing alone in that field facing 300 warriors and wondering if he was about to die. And he smiled because that moment of desperation had led to everything good that came after. Branch came out onto the porch, moving carefully on joints that ached with age, and settled onto the bench beside Jake, and they sat together in comfortable silence watching the sun climb higher. Finally, Jake spoke and asked if Branch remembered that first night, when they had faced each other as enemies, and Branch made the clicking laugh sound and said he remembered, thinking this human was either going to get himself killed or was going to change everything. Jake asked which one had happened, and Branch said both because the old Jake who thought he could fight alone had died that night and been replaced by someone who understood that strength came from cooperation, not isolation. They watched as Kresh led a group of new students across the field, showing them how to check the irrigation system, and Jake felt proud seeing how naturally humans and Apache worked together now, and how strange it seemed that there had ever been conflict. Branch said that historians were calling Jake the founder of interspecies cooperation and writing books about the Nueva Vista model and teaching his methods in schools across human space, but Branch wanted to know what Jake himself thought his legacy would be. Jake was quiet for a long time thinking about the question, and finally he said that he hoped his legacy would be simply that he had tried to do the right thing even when it seemed impossible, and that he had chosen to build instead of destroy and to trust instead of fear. Branch nodded and said that was a good legacy, but Jake was being too modest because what he had really done was prove that humans were capable of more than conquest and exploitation. And that was a lesson the entire species needed to learn. Jake laughed and said that all he had done was refuse to give up his ranch and get lucky that the Apache were willing to listen. And Branch disagreed and said that luck only came to those who were prepared to recognize it. And Jake had been prepared because he understood the land and respected those who lived on it. They fell silent again, and Jake thought about all the ranchers and farmers across 27 worlds who were building their own versions of what he had started, and he hoped they remembered that cooperation was not easy and required constant work and compromise, but it was worth the work because the alternative was endless conflict and wasted potential, and Jake had seen enough of both to know that humanity needed to choose a different path if it was going to survive among the stars. Helen Price visited that afternoon, and she was now the director of colonial relations and had been instrumental in spreading the cooperative model across human space. And she came bearing news that the Colonial Council had voted to name Jake as the first recipient of the Interspecies Cooperation Medal. Jake tried to refuse, the honor saying he did not want medals or recognition. But Helen insisted and said the award was not really for him, but for everyone who had worked to build the cooperative system, and Jake was just the symbol they were using to recognize all of them. When she put it that way, Jake agreed to accept the medal, and Helen hugged him and said that he had given humanity a gift that would echo through generations and that future colonists would live in peace because of what he had started. Jake felt embarrassed by the praise, but also grateful that his work had meant something, and that the suffering and fear of that first confrontation had led to something lasting and valuable. That evening, the ranch held a celebration to honor both Jake's award and the 10th anniversary of the cooperative, and over 500 people attended, including humans and Apache and members of 4 other species who had adopted similar models. Children performed songs in multiple languages, and the Apache warriors demonstrated their traditional dances, and human musicians played folk music from Earth, and everyone shared food and stories and laughter. Jake stood watching it all and feeling overwhelmed by what they had built together, and Kresh came to stand beside him and said that this was what they had been fighting for all along, even if they had not known it at the time. Jake agreed and said that he had thought he was just defending his ranch, but he had actually been defending a vision of how different species could live together, and that vision had turned out to be more powerful than any weapon as the celebration continued. Branch pulled Jake aside and told him something that the Apache elders had decided, but had not yet made public, which was that they were adding a new chapter to their historical record specifically about the night Jake had faced the war party. The chapter would be called The Human Who Changed Everything, and it would teach future generations of Apache about how one crazy rancher with broken equipment and desperate courage had shown them a better way to live. Jake felt tears in his eyes and said he did not deserve such an honor, but Branch said that honors were not about deserving, but about remembering, and the Apache would remember Jake's courage and creativity for as long as their species survived. The celebration went late into the night, and eventually people began to leave, and Jake and Kresh and Branch sat together on the porch one last time. Watching the stars come out, Branch asked Jake what he would do next now that the cooperative was established and thriving, and Jake said he was going to keep ranching because that was what he loved and what he was good at, and fame and medals did not change that. Kresh said that was the right answer because the ranch needed Jake to stay grounded in the daily work that had made everything else possible. And besides, someone had to make sure the next generation of ranchers learned to do things properly. They sat together in peaceful silence, and Jake thought about how his life had turned out and how a moment of desperate improvisation had changed not just his own fate, but the fate of countless others across the stars. He had been called crazy for choosing to ranch beyond the safety zones, and maybe he was crazy, but it was the kind of crazy that saw possibilities, where others saw only problems and refused to accept that violence was inevitable. The kind of crazy that stood alone, against impossible odds, armed with nothing but smoke and mirrors and absolute determination, and the kind of crazy that believed cooperation was always worth trying, even when everyone said it could not work. And in the end, that kind of crazy had turned out to be exactly what humanity needed to survive and thrive among the stars.